speaker today. Thank you so much, Dr. Mushira Habib, for conducting this first forum. And I want to also thank Vincent Gomez, our lecturer at DH, who's there upstairs, for putting this thing together and taking care of the arrangements. So if we are ready to start with the lecture, is it right? Ready? Okay. So I will hand over to Raisa to conduct the next part of the session. And thank you all very much. Please pay attention, take notes. You can have a chance to ask questions about the topic after the forum, after the lecture. And I hope you will be able to get the answers that you're looking for. All right? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arifa ma'am, for introducing the theme to us. So now we're moving on to the highlight of today's forum. I would like to invite today's speaker, Dr. Mushira Habib. Before she takes the stage, a brief introduction of her. So she is an assistant professor in the Department of English and Humanities at ULAB. Before joining ULAB, she was a visiting assistant professor at Colorado College, USA, and completed her PhD in comparative literature from the University of Oregon, USA. A neurodivergent scholar and activist herself, she is passionate about the inclusion and acceptance of neurodivergence in academic spheres. She researches and teaches anti-oppressively and practices trauma-informed perspectives. She is currently on a time-traveling ride and has landed somewhere back in time where neurodivergence is still being debated. So she hopes with this year's CI forum, the wheels will move forward a little bit. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Mushira Habib.
Thank you, Raisa. Thank you, Arifa ma'am, and everybody who's here. I am not a slides person. Any of my students will know I don't do slides very well. So my slides are pretty bare bones. I will try to keep your attention for about 20, 25 minutes and then leave the floor open for Q&A. And if you feel like we are getting the point, we don't need to go over every class and how we can integrate that into our conversation on the topic, then we can move on to Q&A sooner. I would like to start with a video.
See the table there?
Yes.
What do you see now?
A vase with a rose in it like this one.
Looks like a table lamp to me.
You need to get your eyes examined. It's a vase.
Are you absolutely sure?
Of course I'm sure.
Suppose everybody in this restaurant swore that it was a table lamp. Would you still see a vase?
Kunal, please.
So then, whose reality is more real? Yours or theirs?
So this is how I wanted to start. This scene is from a movie called 15 Park Avenue, which is a very good representation of schizophrenia. But this scene in particular, I thought could shed light on differing perspectives, us looking at the same things, but seeing different things and interpreting different things, right? So neurodivergence is all about perspectives, worldviews, ways of living or not, being and not being. So basically, because of how it's defined, the idea is that it's a divergence from neurotypicality. So what we think of as typical, the majority, debatable, but the dominant majority of people identify with neurotypical ways of being and living. But some of us, the more time passes, the more of us are realizing and coming out as neurodivergent people. And the original term came from Tasian Asasumasu in 2000, and she describes neurodivergence as neurocognitive functioning that diverges from dominant social norms. So in my class, when I was trying to explain it, I drew a straight line and I showed that if the straight line is the expected social norm and neurotypicality, typical for our thoughts, then any divergence from it, it can be a wiggly line, it can be a line that was going straight and suddenly goes a different direction, it can be a circle, it can be going in multiple directions, all variations of that divergence or diversion would be considered neurodivergence. The term neurodiversity gained popularity before neurodivergence from a sociological perspective. The idea was not to think about the different kinds of brains and brain functions as a deficit or a disorder, to think about it just as diversity. People are different, the way they look at the world is different, the way they do things are different. So from the beginning of time, we've had the artistic ones among us, right? We have, I don't know, think about Tagore or Quasimodo, neither of them like school or finished school, right? But did that stop their genius to flourish? They didn't fit in the typical school system, but they were talented or skilled enough still to continue with their passion. So whenever there has been encouragement or privileges where you could be different and were able to pursue that difference, neurodivergence was shining without any names, right? And so we've always had the concept of the different one. Every family has the one that's not like the other ones, right? They may have some neurodivergence. So neurodivergence then not only means ADHD or the autism spectrum, which there's a lot of talk about, but any other mental health condition that has changed your perspective for you to look at the world or be in the world slightly differently from others. And neurodivergence doesn't have to be a lifelong thing either. You could have a traumatic event in your life and you could have altered view of the world for a couple of weeks. Let's say you are grieving somebody's loss. You are unfortunately, you had a contraction and you have a couple of weeks or months where you are thinking or feeling differently than your usual self, that can also be neurodivergence. Neurodivergence is common in aging, dementia, Alzheimer's, বয়স হইলে ভুলে যায়, বয়স হইলে উল্টাপাল্টা করে. Anybody who's been a caregiver for dementia or Alzheimer's know that they become rebels. They don't want to listen to you. They become teenagers, right? Because there are other things that are going on in their minds that are making them not follow the neurotypical guidances and instructions, right? So to think of neurodivergence as a big thing that you carry all your life is not necessarily the case. Sometimes you can have a neurodivergent episode, you can have a neurodivergent interpretation. So for example, I'll have so many examples, but for example, everybody is trying to establish a rule, and as a teacher or as an administrator, you suddenly think that it might not be universal or inclusive enough. Some students might prefer a different variation of the rule. So you are then proposing a neurodivergent way of looking at that rule and its exceptions and its loopholes, right? So it doesn't have to be a constant label. It can be practiced in different ways. And so for this presentation further, we'll think about how that looks for literary engagement and what neurodivergence and literature can mean. And I have roughly 5 points. So one way of thinking about neurodivergence and literature is to think about representation of neurodivergence in literature, right? So from the beginning, if you think about all the clown figures or the madmen in Greek tragedies or Shakespearean plays, right? They are always giving us alternative explanations or alternative ways of foreshadowing in the plot. So they were there in the plot. We have different mental health issues represented throughout, right? And so those will keep coming back when we look into specific courses. I'll talk more about this. And then there's readings of neurodivergence in literature. So the characters or the plot might not be outwardly neurodivergent, but we are reading neurodivergence into it, right? So again, we have plenty of examples. If somebody is traumatized in the story, and if we think that a lot of their actions post-trauma is coming from that original trauma, that's our way of reading neurodivergence into the plot of the character. Practice of literature can be neurodivergence. So there are authors and poets who write very differently. Their writing from just looking at it will look different. So an example of this would be a lot of poets and authors who leave a lot of pages blank in their publication, intentional blank pages, little writing, a lot of blank pages, words going everywhere, right? There are different ways of practicing that in literature. In my slides, I have examples of Jean Rees, who you may have read in the post-colonial or feminist context. Her White Supremacy is the most popular work, but she, for example, has a story called Hunger. And Hunger is written from an eating disorder perspective and how the world looks and feels completely different. So if somebody identifies with an eating disorder, they will immediately be able to see what the author is trying to show through her writing, right? So then neurodivergent engagement with literature can also look like view writing about literature in a neurodivergent way. So literary criticism or literary analysis done from an outwardly neurodivergent perspective. If somebody could pull up my PDF file. So I have a published article of my own um, tab. And so in this mostly confusing for anybody who hasn't read the whole thing, it's called Don't Let Me Be Lonely Run In. Take to scroll for a second. So the book that I am writing about is written from a depression, loneliness, almost suicidal point of view, and my engagement piece in it is also is written from that point of view. So content warning, mention of suicide. If we scroll a little further, then we'll see that after I've said a bunch of things about the theme, which is poems I live with, I will do this, so I'm sorry. I can read it myself. So basically, after saying some things about how I read and work with poetry and how I live with poetry, because that was the topic of the issue that the journal was in, I say then there's the speculation that none of these issues are or were that big of a deal to a mind that's not on the overthinking train of the ADHD autism spectrum. All my perspectives, experiences, literacies, and literary recollections might just be figments of my ADHD imagination. All these possibilities of my realities might be true in some capacity and overlap to create this practical academic who has taken up this project to write about poems I live with, now in the USA in English. Claudia Don't Let Me Be Lonely, an American lyric, and Citizen, an American lyric are poems I have been living with since this leg of my journey began. As a literature graduate student, I imagine living with to take the forms of reading, researching, writing about, returning to and thinking about for a prologue period. Amid the absolute chaos of moving to the USA, going through layers after layers of struggles to adjust to the new systems, feelings of alienation and overwhelm, all at the same time, all the time, I found solace in Don't Let Me Be Lonely. Although it might seem like an odd book to find comfort in, the voice in these poems was speaking a language I understood, going through struggles I experienced, feeling feelings I recognized, and giving voice to thoughts I hadn't shared with others before. My empath senses, my affective disposition, my overwhelmed core, made up of a lifetime of ADHD-induced emotional dysregulation, my vague memories of numerous unsuccessful suicide attempts, PTSD from personal and social grief, all were represented, addressed, and given voice to wider. So, very personal, but also very academic. This is not only writing about a piece that is neurodivergent, but exposing the neurodivergence of the author that is engaging with the text in a way a neurotypical person couldn't have that. And then accommodating neurodivergent and participation in the literature classroom is something else that I wanted to talk about. So again, a lot of disruptions in discussions can be very illuminating. That doesn't mean we are constantly expecting to be disrupted during a discussion, but sometimes neurodivergence can interfere with our regular broadcast of the thing we were talking about and bring in a different perspective. So, for example, if we are trying to think about accommodation, something that our country hasn't done yet is an accessibility sector. In the US, every university has an accessibility center, and the accessibility center receives paperwork for accommodations needed for individual students with different neurodivergent conditions. And then the instructors receive a letter from the accessibility center naming the student and what kind of accommodations they will require. So, for example, we would get requests for extra time for sitting exams. We would get low distraction exam taking. So some students would take exams separately with the accessibility center because they would get distracted if they sat among the class and took the exam. Right? A lot of different variations of accommodation. So that's something I really want to see start in Bangladesh, but we haven't got there yet, right? We can still engage in practices where we excuse students for genuine reasons of neurodivergence. So I always tell my students if there's a topic we are reading that triggers something in you that I didn't have foreseen, or a student says something out of the ordinary that someone triggers to take a walk, take a walk. And it's as simple as letting your students take a walk sometimes, right? And so then I was moving on to representations. Again, there are entire movements, literary movements. For example, the language poetry movement, which has poets that only write neurodivergently. And their lived experiences, embodied experiences, imagined experiences come from those neurodivergent experiences. So I have given the example of Jimmy's already. There's Harukapian who writes in very fragmented, almost illegible versions because you need to read all of her work and her biographical blog books, etc., to be able to make sense of the whole thing. She does not want to let you in fully. It's an intentional choice to make it less accessible to her readers. Leslie Scalabino uses her language disorders in her poetry, so she will intentionally write in wrong grammar because she had a language learning difficulty and she wanted to represent that in her poetry. And then comics and graphic novels and any of these sorts of literature gives you options. Which panel do you want to read first? How much time are you spending in the writing versus staring at the pictures? Are you only looking at the pictures and can you still make a story out of it, right? Those are also neurodivergent ways of looking at it. Often, neurodivergence can be a student-led movement, which is why I'm mostly looking at students. It can come from unexpected ways, as I was mentioning earlier, and the examples I have are from my last semester teaching here. Even during the Viva, I will not look at certain students. Even during the Viva, I had students share intricate details of neurodivergent engagement, right, which were unexpected. I wondered only as a cloud, who thought it could have a neurodivergent aspect? I had a student who didn't get into military and was depressed, and then had found friends in ULAB in the English department, and they connected with I Wonder Dolly as a cloud, and their friends were the daffodils in their life, right? I had students tell me about their suicide attempts at the age of 8. I have students who couldn't speak about Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cry of the Children without crying. These were during Bibles, right? The student had grown up in Narayanganj in very industrial area, and they had grown up alongside the children that work at factories and whatnot, right? I have students say, I felt a funeral in my brain is their reality. They feel funerals in their brains, right? So just from the conversation of which were their favorite poems, who were their favorite poets, these neurodivergent engagements came up in a way that it wouldn't have come up in written exams. So then I have the whole list of all the literature classes being offered this term in the department. And I have some ways to think about how to kind of engage neurodivergently with the content. So again, during Q&A, you can ask me to elaborate. There was a lot of courses, and I just tried to bring some of my ideas here. So Introduction to Literary Genres as Francis Bacon, and I just took one of his quotes and tried to think about it neurodivergently. For it says, for natural abilities are like natural plants that need pruning. So if somebody has neurodivergence in their literary engagement, that also needs pruning, right? So they should be able to cultivate and practice it to be able to do it better. Kate Chauvin, many of our courses has her Louis Mallard's heart condition, the monstrous joy. Why is it monstrous? Because it's not a typical expected joy that was taking her over. And then the joy that kills, we know that it wasn't a joy, but the stereotypical normative doctor couldn't have thought of a shock of seeing her husband alive and seeing her, so it had to be out of joy that she must have died, right? So the imposition of the typical perspective on a neurodivergent feeling. And then Animal Farm, again, we see a lot of narcissistic characters, we see social psychopathic tendencies, we see alcoholism. Any substance abuse can lead to neurodivergent because your mental faculties are altered, right? Next, we have introduction to poetry and drama. So we have Robert Browning's My Last Duchess this time, who psychopath, kills his wife for smiling at everybody. Dickinson, last term I taught at the funeral. This time I'm teaching Much Madness is Divided Sense. Again, madness makes sense to some people. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet has brutal suicide, and we have suicide survivors in our classrooms. We have suicide survivors in our classrooms. We don't think about that when we're teaching some of these topics. Yeats, the late Isle Ministry, the gray pavements. The gray pavements hit some of us much harder than others, right? That's again a very impressive voice. Adrian Mitchell's Jennifer's Tigers, aunt is dead, but we can almost see that she may have lived a very oppressed life, right? So must have had some conditions that can be read neurodivergently. My Angelou's phenomenal woman changed half of my poetry and drama students' outlook in life. Everybody who lived himself down, self-image issues, fat phobic issues, wellness culture issues, they found a new way of looking at themselves, and most of the classes wrote their essays on it. Introduction to fiction and non-fiction, again, well-lighted place, again, very easily can be read as a PTSD narrative. That whole collection of Hemingway's writing can be, I have one in my gender class, things like White Elephants. It Manual writing is often considered one of the earliest signs of PTSD writing, where he does not talk about the real trauma or the real issue and just talks about everything else. So that's an example. Again, they heard again potentially has psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, so on, discussing murder without any guilt or shame. Private prejudice, so much we could do, right? Mrs. Bennett is called a hypochondria, which is again an OCD-like condition. And then she has controlling narcissistic behaviors where the wealth and success of her potential sons-in-law decides what value or status she has in the society. We can think of Victim again, who is potentially sociopathic, and then we can think about Mary Bennett, potentially on the autism spectrum, just her thing likes to perform the things that she likes, very rigid in her pursuits. Lydia, potentially ADHD, too gullible, too high-spirited, to see through people's yes, I can't think of a better one. And then Elizabeth Jacobian drama, I have previously mentioned how Dr. Faustus may have had ADHD because he doesn't finish the books he reads, doesn't understand them properly, in the rush to read the next big book, right? And we see that he has like quick forgetfulness, he will have moments of guilt and immediately move on from that behavior to enjoying his success again. Volponi and Mosca, once again we've got ourselves some sociopathic narcissistic personalities thriving off of each other. Wasila, in the Duchess of Malfi, the king of overthinking and procrastination, but then eventually its mania has to kill everybody, including itself, right? Is Tyler on the spectrum? Can be a whole paper, but we can also think about historical generational trauma that makes you so removed from society that you are so focused on your business, and you become so good at it, and you're so focused on your contract, nobody can change anything about it. So it can be read as the spectrum, or it can be read as trauma response. Writing about literature, for this one I was thinking more about the authors. Cisneros, of course, has a lot of marginality, hybridity, and so on. Brings about a spectrum of mental health issues, sharing how her own consciousness is so entangled with those of her characters that she would confuse her realities from time to time. Frost, again, in many of his writings, has been called suicidal and has denied it vehemently. And then Kipling, I think, is an empath who's been forever misunderstood by his white readership, but continue to be the empath and allied to produce his literature. Romantic poetry. Blake's chimney sweeper has childhood trauma, has depression and lethargy. Kubla Khan was opium induced to the point where when he came back to his senses, he couldn't finish writing the poem. Coleridge, we are talking about Coleridge. Gibson's ode to melancholy, depression, melancholy, ode to psyche, again, very directly talking about mental health issues. Ancient Greek literature, Oedipus has a lot of madness, psychosis, banishment, or blindness, thinking about different ways of feeling, living, and so on. So something that can also bring about neurodivergence is different disabilities, right? So the way Oedipus was living his life before going blind and after going blind is going to be starkly different, and his way of looking at the world it would be different. The frogs can kind of be read as a play written from a sense of humor coping strategy in response to needs. Modernism in literature, Joyce that there has brief anxiety, hopelessness, found in a station of the metro is an ADHD leader's dream because the poem is so short and has so much meaning we can keep reading forever. Um, the second coming to me is like a perfect description of neurodivergence. The things fall apart, the center cannot hold. The wasteland again is depression, anxiety, paranoia, Wolf's stream of consciousness, very different way of writing, but became one with a modernist technique. Mrs. Dalloway, of course, has a lot of PhD as well. Critical theory, I won't be able to pronounce his name today. And Derrida is also linguistic neurodivergences, language-related neurodivergences. Foucault can be studied in relation to the marginalization of the neurodivergent populations through discipline and punish or pedagogicism, right? The over-policing of the neurodivergent. Freud, Fanon, all about psychology, right? So, like we can go on now. Science was living and theorizing anxiety, its PTSD, depression, anxiety, amnesia, and so on. Butler is theorizing for forming bodies, neurodivergent. Restoration and 18th century literature. I did a triggered reading of the rape of the dog, the trivialization of rape, and how it still continues to be the curriculum without a discussion of the problem with the word is how patriarchy has normalized the word and trivialized it, right? So if you are an essay survivor or victim, this is difficult to read. The way of the word criticizes narcissistic, gaslighting, sociopathic society. It was a social problem, of course. Robinson Crusoe, the father of collective post-colonial PTSD giver and slave owner. The schizophrenic or bipolar relationship he had with Friday. Some days he was just a slave, some days he was his man Friday, right? I am going on and on. We are almost out of time. Should I continue? Literary criticism has the poetry definitions, right? So I asked us to think about if the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions never stopped, kept going, right? That would be neurodivergence. And emotional dysregulation. Willing suspension of disbelief in poetry. What about the unwilling suspension of disbelief? That is neurodivergence. Thinking through neurodivergent traditions and the individual talent could be aware, engaging with aliens, again be helpful, and then why the normal matters to be able to diagnose ourselves and others from the patterns of behavior that can be neurodivergent. American literature, one has been Winkle, learning reality and imagination, Poe, forever interested in psychopathy, pathology, and all of that. So all his writing has some of it. Emerson, immanence and transcendence can very easily be applied to conditions like schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, dementia, Alzheimer's. Treatment, I have a quote that can be read as his interest in the brain. Douglas, Jacobs, all the emancipated, enslaved authors There, writing can be read to us theories of the brain, which is unmasked into looking into the world. Melville, I referenced before, but to be is probably opposite. American literature too, Morrison, all about PTSD, torture, memory, trauma, amnesia, lab, anxiety, depression, psychosis, suicide. Tennessee Williams has a histrionic character, named as such. Um, the daughter has some issues, and the son is growing up to proximity to mental health conditions. William Curtis Williams himself had to be institutionalized for his depression towards the end of his life. Joy Harjo is living, writing, and singing the schizophrenic conditions of the late medical school of cinema and literature again depends on what is being taught and watched. I gave the example of Laura which is on the syllabus, thinking about dysphorias, dysmorphias, eating disorders, dissociations, delusions, and so on. Then again, I have a whole chapter on my dissertation about reading Bollywood from a PTSD point of view, so I will go on about that. I had a song here to give us a break, but we got bus time for that. Postcolonial theories and literature, science, and achieve writing of the damage, books like Heart of Darkness or the representation of the Orient and the psyche of a black or colonized leader, while Thiago and Césaire pointed out the damage done to colonized populations through the English language literature and education. Things Fall Apart has Noe, who was drawn to music and hated the night for his father worship. Postmodernism in literature, like modernism, has some of the neurodivergent conditions inbuilt into the framework, like anxiety, depression, paranoia, fragmentation, narcissism, perversion, amnesia, and so on. Garcia Marquez's stories from Strange Philippines or Borges and Heller's novels reverse the split on what is insanity versus sanity. And then I think this is the last course, gender theory and literature has like all of that and all of those. On top of that has a marigold in the attic. It was the yellow wallpaper where we see hallucinations, we see gaslighting. So we see the performer of those conditions like sociopathic tendencies and the victim of it directly. And then Morrison's dualist eye has self-hatred, internalized basis, self-images, sexual trauma, OCD. OCD was the pedophile that turned young women very cleaner. So that's why it's very after. So that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the insightful talk. Since we are short on time, we will now to the question and answer segment of the forum. So the floor is now open for any questions from the audience. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole and I'm from fifth semester. So when I was actually during her thoughts on this topic, I came across that I remember one certain character. He takes children from young children and capacity. So young is a democracy talk. So they put a character like as a main character and for the last talk from divergent community, neurodivergent community, where he says something which is not correct, but socially really awkward, and camera shifts to his people and how we often laugh at such characters as comic relief. And I feel like that the media representation of the neurodivergent maybe somehow influence us how we would react to that in real life. For example, like when I was actually searching one comment, like see one comment section of young children speak, there people were naming children as selfish, then mean, and nice. So this type of reaction came from the media representation of neurodivergent community and also literature. So how do you see that and how do you react to such representations?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I mean, shelter was never made. Neurodivergence is the audience, it's the reception of shelter that calls neurodiversity, right? So, the representation we do things. One is it started young shelter as a whole series. It wouldn't have existed if it wasn't that popular. So he's been named to be on the autism spectrum, right? And for the people who don't see themselves represented as almost a main character in such a big media production, this was great. But then, of course, there's going to be the critiques that cannot accept neurodivergence and comment silly things. We just have to ignore them and move on like any other comment section of any other media production, right? Comment sections is also exposing a lot of people who need to go to therapy instead of comment sections, right? So I think Sheldon's representation did very well for the neurodivergent community. The comment sections